So let's start off with better surveys. And this really should start, I suppose, with brand tracking programs, which I'm using just as an example because this is a really big ticket item, it's expensive, and it's really the cruise liner of the research industry, isn't it? It's big, it's got everything in it, including the kitchen sink, and most people would rather do anything than be stuck in a brand tracking presentation. We need to get to a place where we've got a speedboat. We need something that is much smaller, more nimble, more fit for purpose. And really it's about being more accurate and more future focused. And all of those things really go together. You can be more nimble if you're more future focused. If you're focusing on the right things, it's more fit for purpose. And the important thing about this is that it's not just about hacking off half the questionnaire or chunking it up into modules but still asking everything. It's about applying principles to get to a better place. Principles like redundancy. Don't ask the same thing in 3 different ways. Relevance. Don't ask a person something that is completely irrelevant to them because you'll get rubbish back. And predictiveness. Ask questions in a way that predict their future behaviour rather than focusing on something that might have no bearing on what they're actually going to do. And I know this sort of sounds like a standard preamble and everyone goes, yeah, I know we need to do shorter questionnaires and I know we need better data. I can't tell you how many times I've had the conversation with people that say, yeah, we definitely need shorter, smarter questionnaires to get better quality data to make better decisions. And then bit by bit, all the decision makers and the stakeholders throw in their 2 cents worth and you end up with the cruise liner again. So let me just start out by saying it's an education piece that we need to do across the industry and across our businesses. We need to make sure that we're being really disciplined about getting better information to make decisions. And the accuracy and the future focus piece is really, really important when it comes to the sorts of activations that you can do with data nowadays. So Jonathan talked about the Holiday Inn example. That was a really exciting application of better quality survey information. If you can really quickly find out who are the people that are more likely to buy more of my product, you can get much better sales results, and that's what it's all about, isn't it? So the Holiday Inn example is fantastic, over 500% uplift in bookings. But we've used this for a CPG example, FMCG. A beverages manufacturer got 15% uplift in offline sales by applying better targeting. So it sounds as though having better surveys is just a really dull conversation to have, but actually in the real world, it allows you to make better decisions and get far better sales results as a result. So, you've figured out who you need to talk to. The next question, though, is how do you make sure that you're going to get those people's attention? So Jonathan talked about all the devices that people are using. 67% of people, when they're watching one screen, are screen stacking. So when you've reached somebody, you know that you've done your work up front, you've figured out who are the right people to talk to. Well, what's the point in that if it's going to just blur into the background, if it's going to be wallpaper? So let's play a game here. Get out a pen and paper or a screen, notes page of your phones, and I want you to make a mark every time a coloured box appears on the screen, unless it's blue. Okay, and at the end we're going to count how many marks everybody has. Okay, so make a mark whenever a coloured box appears unless it's blue. Okay, thanks.
Drip it. Drizzle it. Dash it. Baste it. Splish it. Splash it. Shake it. Dip it. Squiggle it. Jiggle it. Fry it. Roast it. Mash it. Naturally brewed for over 300 years. Cook it up with Kikkoman soy sauce. And try our teriyaki sauce.
How was that? Interesting experience? Not your usual... Oh, yeah, we can move on then. Thank you. Okay, so as you can imagine, this is less about how many marks you got on your page and more about the experience of attention. And we didn't just sit there and say, now please watch this ad, because that's not what happens when you're watching content on whatever screen it is. Oops. Now this is the sort of output that you'd get from doing that sort of exercise. So we'd be able to tell you how good your execution is at attracting away attention from whatever other activity people are doing. What's the subconscious attention score that ad got? And really importantly, which are the scenes that are doing that job the best? Now that Kikkoman ad was one of the better ads that we've tested, so you probably would have found the task a bit challenging. You would have seen lower accuracy scores. You might have forgotten about not clicking on blue, and slower response times because you were getting your attention dragged away, particularly in some of those scenes based at Masha and the lead up to the brand reveal at the end. So some really useful information about which scenes are grabbing attention and how likely the ad is to cut through in that attention economy. So it's interesting that this was an ad that performed well, but there's no storyline. It's a series of mashed up cooking scenes. So how can we really measure what happens when your hungry brain is processing that commercial? How can we measure whether that ad is going to be successful if you launch it? And I don't know if anyone's familiar with this stat. It was a really interesting finding by two Institute of Practitioner of Advertising researchers, Binet and Field. A couple of years ago, they looked at all of the commercials that had been submitted for awards and found that the ads that had been pre-tested did worse over the long term than ads that had not been pre-tested. And if there are any creatives in the room, that echoes what creatives have been saying for years. That is a really interesting wake-up call for us, isn't it? That the way that we've been pre-testing advertising for so long is fantastic at predicting sales, short-term success, but not so good at predicting the long-term brand building ability that's going to be essential to a successful brand in the future. And so what we, and that applies to our pre-testing approach as well. So we went back and we said, okay, well, what are the things that are really important to understand how an ad is really getting into the subconscious? And it turns out there were 3 things that an ad needs to do. And this could be the topic of a whole other session, so I won't go into detail. But in order to bypass the screen out mechanism that our brains have developed, an ad needs to be novel, and this is not about being gimmicky. This is about just giving the brain something that it doesn't already know. Making your subconscious brain go, oh, hold on a second, I need to learn something here. Can I please pay attention? And that's what happened in the Kikkoman ad. The second thing is that it needs to have affective impact. And this is really the ability to connect deeply enough that it elicits emotions. So Monty did that for us. Monty really was good at eliciting emotions. But it doesn't have to be gooey emotions. It just has to be a strong emotion of some description. And then the third part, the bit that predicts whether it's going to be retained in the memory in the long term, is whether there's personal relevance. So those 3 things are really critical to predicting whether a brand is going to be able to build long-term an ad is going to be able to build long-term equity for your brand. So let's take an interesting example. And the reason that this is interesting is because of what it looks like in social media and the way that it went viral. So you're probably familiar with this ad from Budweiser in the Super Bowl this year. To what extent did you feel that this ad was different or unusual? Second question. How vividly does the ad you've just seen remind you about things you personally care about? Third question. When you think about beer, to what extent did this ad contain something that is relevant for you? So how do you think that ad has gone, at building a connection for the brand? Yeah, it's, well, let's see, it did fantastic on novelty. Definitely was something that you didn't expect. It definitely tugged on those heartstrings again. It was in the worst performing group of all ads that we tested, that we have tested, in terms of relevance, which makes sense, right? Everyone watching here would have gone, when I think about beer, that's not the first thing that comes to mind. And that's really interesting when we look at what the pattern that looks like in social media. So I talked earlier about the different patterns or different footprints that advertising gets in the social media. And you can guess what sort of pattern the Budweiser one is. Absolutely huge in terms of volume. People, it was by social media, it was supposed to be the one that won the Super Bowl. And you can see, though, when we look at it more deeply, most of the conversation is emanating out from the official account. People are going, oh, that's nice, I'll forward it on. That's nice, I'll share that. But there's very little genuine engagement and conversation that has been created around that ad, and that's because it doesn't have the relevance. So that leads us on to the second part of the equation, which is better social. And I'm sure everyone in this room has been through the cycle with social media of 5 years ago going, oh, there's this great data source, there's going to be loads of insights there. And then what you end up with is either a dashboard that doesn't really tell you a lot, or this fire hydrant of individual pieces of information that you can't find the insights to save yourself. And so everyone's sort of come a full circle and come back to the beginning going, right, there's this great data source and I need to figure out how I'm going to get the insights out of it. And one of the things we've learned over the last few years is that you need to know what questions you want to ask social media, any big data source. You need to be really focused. You need to use your survey and other frameworks to figure out what is it that I need to ask of social media. And so we need to go from just monitoring to looking for the meaning. We need to go from just counting to really figuring out what are the pieces of information that are going to add value to our business. So earlier I talked about these footprints. Anyone want to guess which one the Budweiser one was? Yeah, haven't spoke. Can you think of an ad which might be a spin-off pattern? Could be loads. I mean, one example is the Apple Watch ad. We looked at that and found that the Apple Watch ad, there was a central communication. A few communities really picked it up and looked at it and had comments on it, but it didn't get the whole viral effect that we saw with something like the John Lewis one. The interesting thing is that, let me just build this. Okay, so when we look at why that is the case, looking at our three metrics, you can see that the spin-off style is typically going to sort of perform average in terms of the novelty and affect, but it's quite polarising on the relevance. There are some people for whom it's incredibly relevant, others for whom it's not. The ecosystem, John Lewis, we talked about, and the competitor to John Lewis is Tesco. And while that ad wasn't a particularly strong ad, where it really fell down was in the novelty. It just wasn't telling people something different that was worth their sort of subconscious brains waking up and going, hey, I think we should pay attention to this. It just didn't get that novelty or cut through. And what that meant was that the conversation wasn't picked up outside of their existing social audience. It didn't expand their footprint in the way that John Lewis was able to. So that's looking at one very specific usage of social media. When we look more broadly, obviously there's a huge amount of stuff that we can do using social and search data. But one of the things that people always ask me or say when we're talking about this type of topic area is, well, how can I really rely on insights from social media because it's not representative? And we're so used to, building sample sizes and things in a way that's going to be representative of the people that we want to talk to, and we can't do that with social media. It is what it is. And we know that a small proportion of people are the ones who publish most of the content. So how do we deal with that? But we're asking the wrong question. When we're using social media data, it's not about whether it's representative or not. That's from the old world where we had to create the data. The question we need to be asking is it predictive? Can we find a way to use social media in a way that's predictive of something that's going to be useful to us? Like brand equity, for example. So this is a case study from the auto category where we did exactly that. We took social data and search data, and it's important to incorporate the search as well. We found that the models can be more predictive when we use social and search. And we said, okay, well, this is the equity score of those three brands, and we were able to predict exactly the same equity score using social and search data. And this is what that looks like over time. So that was a point in time on the previous chart, but it actually reflects the ups and downs of the industry, either in auto or FMCG or any other category that we've looked at. We've been able to build really predictive models of brand equity based on purely social and search data. Okay, that's cool. So what? Well, let's go back to the cruise liner model, the way that we have typically used brand equity in the past. And we've said, okay, well, we know, at a point in time, we go into field and we measure and we say, at this point, this is what the respondents say, your brand equity is 10, your potential market share is 10. And then what would happen is 3 weeks later, or however long later, we report back to the business and we say, well, 3 weeks ago, your brand equity was 10. So imagine the marketing function that is able to get that information 4 to 12 weeks ahead of their competitors. What would you be able to do if you knew that in 4 to 12 weeks, my brand equity will be 10? Well, one example is in FMCG. This talks about confectionery. It's not actually a real confectionery case, but it's based on what really happened. So in this one example, we found that at Easter there was a growth in sales, but after that we forecast that equity was going to fall. A campaign had been planned for a few weeks later, and based on that information, the decision was made to bring the campaign forward to try and mitigate that forecast decline. With the result that the forecast decline in brand equity didn't happen, and actually the brand continued to grow. And then the next period, it was discovered based on social media that the competitor was going to raise prices, so they beefed up their Halloween promotion in order to really capitalise on that potential vulnerability of the competitor. Now, this is just one illustration. I'm sure in your businesses you can think immediately how getting a 12-week jump on the competitors is going to be quite useful. We've talked about this in terms of modelling equity. Obviously, it can be done for modelling sales as well, and we have done that. And it's quite interesting looking at the leading indicators for equity and the leading indicators for sales to really build up a very robust picture of what's happening or what will happen in the business. So, better social doesn't only give us the ability to predict what's going to happen in the future, but it also gives us richer diagnostics. And those diagnostics are both richer in terms of the depth and the insight that we get from them, but also in their ability to predict changes in behaviour and inequity. So this is from a beverages example on the left-hand side, where we took a couple of brands and modelled the ability of image attributes from a survey to predict changes in equity, and then compared that to a social proxy, so a conversation theme that reflected that image idea, and found that the social proxy was far more predictive of changes in equity than what we were measuring in a survey. Which is really interesting if you're thinking about the speedboat. Maybe you don't need to have all of the imagery diagnostics in your tracking all the time, because once you've set this up and you know what are the important things I should be looking in the social data, you can go and ask that of the social data. And on the right-hand side is just an illustration from the Apple Watch of the sorts of insights that you get, which you might have previously got from an open-ended question, but you're getting this at scale. So Washington Post, 4.3 million followers, when they say it's official, even though they can't spell it, it's official, tattoos and the Apple Watch don't mix, that's a really big piece of information, right? That's going out to a lot of people. It's not quite your open-ended that you got from one survey. It's really powerful to know that. So let's bring this all together. Our vision is for the always-on, predictive, social spine. With your speedboat survey, as and when you need it, but that's only going to happen if we can be really disciplined about focusing on exactly what matters, and then using whatever data source is available to answer questions as and when they arise. And that could be using survey, it could be using social, it could be using search, it could be using mobile to go into the moment of consumption or purchase to understand more. And really where we're getting to is that social enhances surveys by giving it speed, being always present, being able to go back in time and look at what happened, even though we might not have had a question in a tracker. And really, I think what's so powerful is it's the authentic, unprompted voice of the consumer. But also, surveys enhancing social. Surveys enhance social because they give you the structure. They tell you what questions you need to ask. They're representative, so they can link to demographics for targeting or profiling or whatever. They explain the why that you might not always be able to identify in social data, and they're going to fill the holes that you might not get from social. So having both together is going to get you to a much better place. And so really where we want to go on the journey, and we're looking for partners that are going to change with us, is we've got to get to really short, smart surveys. We've got to cut down the cruise boat model. By asking the right questions, that's going to help you reduce media wastage because you can target only the right people who are going to be most receptive to your message. We're going to be able to get the jump on competition by having predictions that are future focused, allowing you to act in advance of when you previously would have been able to. And that whole element of speed is going to be brought in through the diagnostics, real-time metrics that you're going to be able to look at as and when they happen, but also dive in to figure out why is that happening. So no more waiting for the cruise liner. Get on the speedboat with us and join us in the journey on Connected Insights.